the 12th of October, 1943. Somewhere over the gray expanse of the North Sea, altitude 11,000 feet, a Luftwaffe Oberleutnant banks his Focke-Wulf 190 through a thin layer of cloud, scanning the horizon for the telltale glint of aluminum. His radio crackles with the lazy confidence of a hunter who knows his prey. "They are sending their Donnervogel again," he says, using the mocking nickname Thunder bird his squadron has coined for the newest American fighter crossing the channel. Fat, slow, built by farmers who know tractors better than fighters. His wingman laughs, a sharp bark of static. "Let them come, we will send them home in pieces." If we send them home at all, the FW-190's engine hums with Teutonic precision, a sound the pilot has learned to trust like his own heartbeat. In his mind, the American machine is already burning. Before we dive in, make sure you're subscribed. Every week, we uncover the stories the world forgot. What he didn't know, what none of them knew yet, was that the Thunderbird carried a fury the Reich had never calculated, a combination of range, firepower, and relentless American industry that would turn the Predator into prey before the year was out. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt weighed 7 tons empty, a grotesque figure for a single-engine fighter, nearly double the mass of the nimble Messerschmitt Bf-109. Critics in the Army Air Forces whispered the same doubts as the enemy: too heavy, too clumsy, a milk truck with wings. But inside that bulk lay an 18-cylinder Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp radial engine generating 2,000 horsepower, fed by a turbocharger that allowed it to breathe thin air at altitudes where German inline engines gasped and stuttered. 8 Browning M2.50 caliber machine guns studded the wings, 4 per side, each fed by belts of 400 rounds. When all 8 fired in unison, the convergence point, set typically at 300 yards, created a cone of destruction that could saw through aluminum, steel, and flesh with industrial efficiency. The guns cycled at 800 rounds per minute apiece, meaning a 2-second burst hurled more than 200 bullets downrange, each round weighing nearly 2 ounces and traveling at 2,900 feet per second. The math was simple and terrible. Anything caught in that storm disintegrated. But raw numbers meant nothing without doctrine, and doctrine was written in blood. Early Thunderbolt squadrons arrived in England in late 1942 and early 1943. Eager and green, pilots barely out of flight school with maybe 200 hours in type. They tried to dogfight, turning and twisting with Focke-Wulfs and Messerschmitts at low altitude, playing the enemy's game. The losses mounted quickly. Thunderbolts corkscrewed into the English countryside, trailing smoke, or limped back to base with hydraulic fluid streaming from shattered lines. Flaps jammed, landing gear refusing to drop. In the ready rooms, young men stared at empty chairs and wondered if they'd been handed a death sentence wrapped in olive-drab paint. Then, a cadre of veteran instructors, men who'd flown in North Africa and the Pacific, began hammering a new gospel into the replacement pilots. "Don't turn with them," one grizzled major told a fresh class at Duxford, his voice flat and final as a coffin lid. "You're flying an anvil with an engine. Use altitude, use speed, dive on them, hammer them, and zoom back up before they know you're gone. Energy is everything. Trade altitude for speed, speed for kills, kills for home." This became the Thunderbolt's catechism: boom and zoom energy fighting, vertical maneuvers that exploited the big Pratt & Whitney-S power, and the aircraft's ability to dive faster than anything in the Luftwaffe without ripping its wings off. Pilots learned to patrol at 25,000 feet, where the turbocharger sang and the enemy labored then roll. Inverted and plunge earthward at 450 miles per hour, the airframe shuddering but holding the gun sight. Reticle crawling onto the pale belly of a FW-190 that never saw death coming from above. March 1944, somewhere over Second Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson, call sign Jug after his Thunderbolt's nickname, felt the first hammer blows walk up his fuselage before his brain registered the danger. A Focke-Wulf 190 had materialized out of a sun he'd glanced away from for just a second. Cannon shells punching through aluminum like fists through wet paper. His canopy exploded inward, shards of plexiglass slicing his forehead, hot oil from a severed line splattering across his flight suit, the stench immediate and nauseating. The stick went mushy in his hand elevator cables, hit hand. The engine coughed, a sickening sputter that meant fuel or fire or both. Johnson hauled the Thunderbolt into a steep dive, gravity his only ally now, the altimeter unwinding in a blur, 18,000, 15,000, 12. The Focke-Wulf stayed with him, the German pilot methodical, firing short controlled bursts, each one tearing new holes, each one supposed to be the killing blow. But the Thunderbolt absorbed it all. The big radial kept turning, despite oil pressure dropping into the red. Pistons hammering against damaged cylinders, the propeller clawing for purchase in thickening air. Johnson leveled off at 2,000 feet over the English Channel, the stick responding again, barely, and nursed the dying machine westward. The Focke-Wulf, either out of ammunition or respect, finally peeled away. Johnson made landfall near Dover, the engine seizing as he touched down, wheels up in a field of winter wheat, the Thunderbolt sliding to a stop in a cloud of torn earth and steam. Ground crew counted 207 holes in the airframe. The cockpit armor behind Johnson's Seta, the thick slab of hardened steel that had seemed like dead weight back at the factory, had stopped 3 20mm cannon shells. He walked away with stitches and a story that rippled through every Thunderbolt squadron in England. The Jug could take it. June 1944, D-Day +3, the skies over Normandy. Captain Walker Bud Mahiran led his flight of 4 Thunderbolts in a wide arc over the bocage, the patchwork farmland below stitched with smoke and fire. His orders were simple: sweep ahead of the advancing infantry, kill anything German that moved. They found a convoy on the Carrington Road, half-tracks and trucks crawling nose to tail, painted Feldgrau and dusted with the pale powder of crushed stone. Mahiran toggled his radio line abreast. 1 pass, guns only. The 4 Thunderbolts rolled into shallow dives, spread out like the fingers of a closing hand, each pilot picking a section of the convoy. Maharan's thumb settled on the gun trigger, a red button on the stick, and he squeezed. The aircraft shuddered, 8 guns roaring, the smell of cordite flooding the cockpit despite the slipstream. Spent brass links rattling against the fuselage. Below, the half-track he'd chosen seemed to come apart from the inside, metal shredding, tires exploding, bodies tumbling from the open rear. He pulled up hard, gravity pressing him into the seat, and looked back over his shoulder. The convoy had become a junkyard, vehicles burning, men scattering into the ditches. His wingman's voice crackled through the static. Target destroyed. Jesus, Bud, there's nothing left. But there was more. They strafed 2 more convoys that afternoon, a fuel dump that went up in a rolling black column visible for 30 miles, and a German staff car that simply ceased to exist under concentrated fire, reduced to scrap and smoke before it could break. That evening near St. Lay, a Wehrmacht Hauptmann was pulled from a ditch by his own men, uniform caked in mud, hands shaking. The Jabos, he whispered, using the German slang for fighter bombers, they are everywhere, all the time. We cannot move in daylight. We cannot supply. They hunt us. The Russians have numbers, he said. The Americans have everything. By summer 1944, Republic Aviation had delivered what the pilots called the A Model Miracle. The P-47 D-25, and later the D-30, incorporated a host of field-tested upgrades that transformed the Thunderbolt from blunt instrument to scalpel. The cockpit canopy was replaced with a bubble design, eliminating the old razorback spine that had blocked rearward vision and turned dogfights into guessing games. Pilots could now see 6 o'clock, the blind spot where death had always lurked. The engine received water injection, a simple system that dumped a mixture of water and methanol into the supercharger during emergency power, cooling the intake charge and allowing the R2800 to punch out 2,300 horsepower for short bursts, enough to catch fleeing jets or climb out of flak traps. The propeller blades widened and reinforced, bit harder into the air, turning that extra power into speed. At full throttle with water injection engaged, the Thunderbolt could hit 460 miles per hour in level flight, faster than all but the newest German designs, and in a dive it became a meteor, untouchable and final. The sound changed to the old Thunderbolt had growled. The M model howled, a rising banshee wail that pilots on the ground could identify from miles away, a sound that meant friendly skies overhead. German troops learned to recognize it as well, and when they heard it, they scattered. Range had always been the Achilles heel. Early Thunderbolts could barely escort bombers to the German border before fuel gauges forced them to turn back, leaving the flying fortresses and liberators naked over the Ruhr and beyond. But American engineers, pragmatic and relentless, solved it with brutal simplicity. External fuel tanks. By mid-1944, Thunderbolts routinely carried to 108-gallon drop tanks slung under the wings, augmenting the internal fuel load of 370 gallons. The tanks were disposable, stamped sheet metal or pressed paper impregnated with resin. Cheap enough to litter across Europe, when combat loomed, pilots toggled a switch, and the tanks tumbled away, freeing the aircraft for battle. With drop tanks, the Thunderbolt's radius stretched to 475 miles, then beyond. Suddenly, Berlin was in range. Suddenly, nowhere in the Reich was safe. The logistics behind this were staggering. Tens of thousands of drop tanks manufactured weekly shipped across the Atlantic in Liberty ship holds, trucked to airfields across England and France filled with high-octane, aviation, gasoline, refined in Texas and Oklahoma, and hung on fighters flown by kids from Iowa and Tennessee. The infrastructure was invisible but absolute, a web of steel and petroleum that German planners could not replicate and could not sever. Role expansion followed inevitably. Thunderbolts, designed as high-altitude interceptors, became the most versatile platform in the theater. Fighter sweeps to clear the skies, bomber escort from England to Silesia and back, close air support, rolling in on German strongpoints with bombs and rockets, armed reconnaissance, prowling the autobahns and rail lines, shooting up anything that moved. By autumn 1944, 8th and 9th Air Force Thunderbolt groups were flying for sometimes 5 sorties per day per pilot, a tempo that ground enemy logistics into dust. A single Group 50-odd aircraft could crater a rail yard, destroy a dozen locomotives, strafe a supply column, and still climb back to 20,000 feet to bounce an enemy fighter sweep, all in one mission. The versatility was dizzying, and it shattered German planning. Luftwaffe commanders could no longer predict where American fighters would appear or in what numbers. They were everywhere, and they kept coming. In the winter of 1944, interrogators from Allied intelligence sat across a table from Oberleutnant Franz Stigora, a Luftwaffe ace with 28 kills, shot down over the Rhine and pulled from the wreckage of his Bf-109. His right arm was in a sling, his face still marked with soot. The interrogator asked about the P-47. Stigler was silent for a long moment, staring at the table. "At first we thought it was a joke," he said quietly. "A cow with wings. Easy kills." He looked up, and his eyes were hollow. "But it does not die. You shoot it, and it keeps flying. You chase it, and it outruns you. You climb, and it is already above you, and there are always more. You shoot one down, and 2 more take its place the next day. We have pilots who have not flown in weeks because we have no fuel, no replacement aircraft. You Americans, you replace everything. It is not a war of skill anymore. It is a war of abundance." He spat the last word like a curse. The numbers told the story with cold industrial precision. By late 1944, Republic Aviation's factory in Farmingdale, Long Island, along with a second plant in Evansville, Indiana, was producing Thunderbolts at a rate of nearly 700 per month. Each aircraft required 15,000 parts, 30,000 rivets, miles of wiring, hydraulic lines fabricated to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch, women in headscarves and overalls, many of whom had never worked outside the home before Pearl Harbor, riveted skins and assembled wings on assembly lines that ran 3 shifts, 24 hours a day. The Pratt & Whitney factories in Connecticut stamped out R2800 engines at a rate that would have seemed impossible in 1940, over 4,000 engines per month by 1944, each one bench-tested for 50 hours before shipment. Ammunition production dwarfed even that. Lake City Army Ammunition Plant in Missouri alone produced over 3 billion rounds of 50-caliber ammunition during the war, enough to equip every Thunderbolt ever built hundreds of times over. The training pipeline, once a trickle, had become a flood. By 1944, the Army Air Forces was graduating over 6,000 pilots per month from training schools, scattered across the American Southwest. Young men with 300 hours of flight, time, gunnery training instrument, flying formation tactics drilled into muscle memory. When a Thunderbolt pilot was killed over Germany, his replacement arrived in England within 72 hours, fresh, trained, and ready. The Luftwaffe, by contrast, was cannibalizing units to keep others flying, sending boys with 60 hours total time into combat against veterans and losing them in their first sorties. December 1944, the frozen skies over the Ardennes, altitude 8,000 feet. The weather had been Germany's ally for 3 days, thick gray cloud that kept Allied aircraft grounded while panzer columns punched through the Ardennes forest in Hitler's desperate gamble to split the Allied lines. But on December 23rd, the clouds broke and the thunderbolts came. Major Francis Gabby Gabreski, back from a POW camp and flying again, led a squadron of 16 P-47Ms to Hotrad, variant into what pilots were already calling the Bulge. Below, columns of German armor stretched for miles. Tigers and panthers crawling nose-to-tail through narrow forest roads, their commanders assured by meteorologists that the Americans would stay grounded for another week. Gabreski's voice cut through the radiochatter.com and final, echelon right, pick your targets, make every pass count. The thunderbolts rolled over and dove, each aircraft carrying a pair of 500-pound bombs and a full ammunition load. The first pass cratered the road ahead of the lead Panther, trapping the entire column. The second pass walked bombs down the line, turning 40-ton tanks into burning hulks. The third pass was pure strafing, 50-caliber rounds hammering through engine decks and open hatches, finding fuel tanks and ammunition stores, creating secondary explosions that tossed turrets like toys. By the time Gabreski pulled his squadron up and headed west for fuel, the column was a smoking graveyard stretching 3 miles. That afternoon, his group flew for more sorties. By nightfall, the Ardennes roads were littered with burned-out German armor. And panzer crews who survived began abandoning their vehicles at the first sound of aircraft engines. Fleeing into the trees, one tank commander, pulled from his disabled Tiger by American infantry 2 days later, was asked why his crew had abandoned a vehicle that was still mechanically sound. "It's the Jabos," he said, "the word a curse and a prayer. We heard them coming and we ran. What else could we do?" The Luftwaffe's final desperation move came in the form of the Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter capable of 540 miles per hour, 100 miles per hour, faster than anything with a propeller. Sleek, deadly, armed with 4 30mm cannons that could shred a bomber with a single burst, the 262 should have been a game-changer. German pilots who flew it spoke in reverent tones about the acceleration, the way it climbed through altitudes where piston engines wheezed the sensation of simply outrunning American fighters. But the 262 had a fatal weakness, one that Thunderbolt pilots learned to exploit with brutal efficiency. The Jumo 004 turbojets were fragile, temperamental, and hungry. They required careful throttle management, took precious seconds to spool up from idle to full thrust, and had a service life measured in hours, not hundreds of hours. Worse, the jets had to land and take off from specific airfields with long runways, and those airfields became killing grounds. Thunderbolt squadrons began orbiting German jet bases at medium altitude, waiting. When a 262 approached to land, gear down, flaps extended, speed bleeding off to avoid overshooting the runway, Thunderbolts dove. The jet pilot, already committed to landing, unable to spool the engines back up quickly enough to abort, became an easy target. Lieutenant Colonel Hubert Zempsey's 56th Fighter Group pioneered the tactic, loitering near Eckmar and Rhine airfields, and by February 1945, they'd destroyed more Me-262s on approach and takeoff than in air-to-air combat. One German jet pilot, Lieutenant Walter Schuck, survived being bounced on final approach by rolling his 262 into a desperate dive that tore off his landing gear but saved his life. "I was helpless," he said later in a debriefing. "The engines would not respond fast enough. I was a duck, and they were hunters." By war's end, the Luftwaffe had built over 1,400 Me-262s, but fewer than 300 ever saw combat simultaneously, and chronic fuel shortages meant many never left the ground. The Thunderbolt, crude and subsonic, outlasted the future. On the ground, the tank battle that defined the Western Front, the long slog through France and into Germany, became another proving ground for Thunderbolt lethality. German armor, especially the Panther and Tiger, outclassed American Shermans in nearly every technical measure. Thicker armor, more powerful guns, better optics. But American tankers had an equalizer that German crews did not: total air superiority. Thunderbolts fitted with 5-inch high-velocity aircraft, rockets, or HVARs, became tank killers. Each rocket carried a solid fuel motor and a warhead capable of penetrating 4 inches of armor plate at the right angle. A Thunderbolt could carry 10 HVARs, 5 under each wing, turning the fighter into a flying artillery battery. Pilots learned to dive at 30 degrees, pickle the rockets at 800 yards, and pull up hard as the salvo streaked downward in a rippling exhaust trail. The rockets weren't precision weapon spread was wide, maybe 50 feet, at impact, but saturation did the job. A single flight of 4 Thunderbolts could blanket a German tank company with 40 rockets in 30 seconds, and even near misses had effects. Tracks blown off, optics shattered, commanders concussed inside their steel boxes, vehicles immobilized and ripe for follow-up strafing. At the Battle of Ericourt in September 1954, 9th Air Force Thunderbolts claimed over 200 German armored vehicles destroyed in a week of near-constant operations. General der Panzertruppe Heinrich Eberbach, captured shortly after, was asked by his interrogators why the German counterattack had failed so catastrophically. He didn't mention tactics or logistics first. "Your aircraft," he said quietly. "We could not move. Every road became a killing zone. My men were brave, but bravery does not stop rockets." Operation Bodenplatte. January 1, 1945, dawned. The Luftwaffe launched its last great gamble, throwing over 900 fighters, every airworthy aircraft they could scrape together, against Allied airfields in Belgium and Holland, hoping to destroy the Allied air forces on the ground in one suicidal strike. The initial attack achieved surprise, catching many aircraft parked and refueling, destroying over 300 Allied planes. But the cost was apocalyptic. Luftwaffe pilots, many of them under-trained replacements, flew into a wall of anti-aircraft fire from bases now bristling with Bofors guns and quads. 50 mounts, losses mounting with every pass. And then the Thunderbolts, those that had been on patrol or scrambled in time, fell on the German formations during their withdrawal. The running air battles stretched across the winter sky for 3 hours. American pilots exploiting superior numbers, better radios, and long-range fuel capacity to chase fleeing Germans all the way back to the Rhine. By noon, the Luftwaffe had lost over 250 aircraft, and critically, nearly 150 pilots, irreplaceable veterans and instructors, the seed corn of any air force. At bases across southern England, ground crews worked through the night, and by the morning of January 2nd, the 300 destroyed Allied aircraft had been replaced. New P-47s, fresh from the factory, sat on the flight lines, fuel trucks topping off their tanks, armorers loading ammunition belts. The Luftwaffe, by contrast, had nothing left to throw. One German fighter controller, listening to the desperate radio calls from pilots who'd survived Bodenplatte, keyed his microphone and said simply, "Do not return to base. There is no fuel, no ammunition, no purpose. You are on your own." The transmission was intercepted by Allied listening posts. It wasn't a tactical report. It was an epitaph. The final scoreboard, compiled painstakingly from combat reports, gun camera footage, and wreckage analysis, told a story of industrial annihilation. By May 1945, Thunderbolt units had been credited with over 3,700 aerial victories, more than any other American fighter type in the European theater. But the air-to-air kills, impressive as they were, paled beside the ground carnage. Thunderbolts destroyed over 7,000 locomotives, crippling German logistics beyond repair. Over 86,000 trucks, tens of thousands of railcars, over 9,000 tanks, and armored vehicles, and uncounted thousands of smaller targets, staff cars, supply dumps, pontoon bridges, radar installations, flak towers. The 9th Air Force alone, operating Thunderbolts almost exclusively in the ground attack role, flew over 400,000 sorties between D-Day and V-Day, an average of over 1,000 per day, every day, for nearly a year. Sortie rates like that had never been seen in warfare. They required an infrastructure of fuel, ammunition, spare parts, and trained personnel that stretched back across the Atlantic, all the way to factories and training schools in America, a supply chain so vast and efficient it became invisible, taken for granted, unstoppable. German commanders, captured in the final weeks, spoke with a kind of exhausted awe about it. General Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, asked what single factor had doomed German forces in the West, answered without hesitation, air power. Not the quality of individual aircraft, we had good planes, but the sheer mass. Hundreds, then thousands. Everywhere, always. You could not plan, could not move, could not rest, and when you destroyed one, 2 more appeared the next morning. It was, he paused, searching for the word, overwhelming. The training pipeline that fed this machine was itself a marvel. By 1944, the Army Air Forces operated over 200 training fields scattered across the American South and Southwest, places with names like Laughlin, Thunderbird, and Randolph, turning civilians into combat pilots in 9 months. Cadets began with basic flight training in simple aircraft, like the Stearman biplane, learning to handle an airplane by feel. Then progressed to more complex trainers, then to a T-6 Texans for advanced work, and finally to operational aircraft like the P-47. By the time a pilot pinned on his wings, he'd logged 300 hours fired. Thousands of rounds at towed targets, practiced formation, flying until it was instinctive, and learned to navigate by dead reckoning across hundreds of miles of featureless desert. German pilot training, by comparison, had collapsed. In 1944, a Luftwaffe replacement pilot was lucky to receive 60 hours of total flight time before being thrown into combat, often with no gunnery training, no instrument time, no formation work. They arrived at the front alone, terrified, and died within days. One Luftwaffe instructor, captured near Munich in April 1945, was asked how Germany could have trained pilots better. He laughed, a bitter sound. "Train them with what?" he asked. "We have no fuel, we have no trainers, we have no time. You ask how we could train pilots like you do. We cannot. You have already won." Production comparisons made the disparity even starker. Republic Aviation and its subcontractors built 15,686 Thunderbolts between 1941 and 1945, an average of over 300 per month, sustained for 4 years. Each aircraft cost approximately $83,000 cheap by the standards of military hardware, and Republic S factories achieved such efficiency that production time per aircraft dropped from over 3,000 man-hours in 1942 to fewer than 800 by 1944. The Germans, meanwhile, produced approximately 34,000 Bf-109s and 20,000 FW-190s across the entire war. Impressive in absolute terms, but divided across 2 fronts and crippled by Allied bombing that destroyed factories, scattered production to underground facilities, and shattered the rail network needed to move parts. By early 1945, German factories were building aircraft faster than they could be fueled or flown, and Luftwaffe units reported having fewer pilots than aircraft. The irony was bitter. The production war had been won so thoroughly that the enemy drowned in their own unused inventory. One captured document, found in the wreckage of a German headquarters near Kassel, laid out the arithmetic of despair with bureaucratic precision. It was a logistics report dated March 1945, stamped Geheimsekretariat. It detailed projected aircraft availability for the next 3 months. The summary line read, "Current operational readiness, 22%. Projected fuel availability, 11 days at reduced sortie rate. Pilot replacement rate, insufficient. Recommendation, none." Scrawled in the margin in pencil, someone had written, "Gott mit uns God with us." It was the old Wehrmacht motto, but here it read like a plea. The museum floor is polished concrete, cool and silent, under the high glass roof of the Smithsonian's Udvar-Hazy Center. The Thunderbolt sits near the entrance, its olive drab paint faded to a soft gray-green, the bare metal panels on its wings dulled by decades. The placard lists statistics: wingspan, length, engine type, armament. Visitors walk past, pause, snap photos, move on. Most don't know the stories carried in those rivets, the blood, the oil, the snow at 30,000 feet, the terror and the fury. In a box of archived documents in the museum's basement, there's a letter typed on onionskin paper, dated July 1946. It's from an anonymous former Luftwaffe pilot to an American researcher, written in careful English. One line stands out. "You asked what we thought of the Thunderbolt. At first we laughed. By the end, we prayed it would not find us. It did not matter. It always found us." Outside, through the museum's glass walls, the sky stretches wide and blue, empty of contrails, silent of engines. The Thunderbird's war is over. The skies belong to those who could build them, fuel them, and send them back, again and again, until there was nothing left to fight. If you love untold stories from history's darkest hours, subscribe and join us on the next mission through time.